I'm Alex, and with me today is my colleague Sina. And today is all about research repositories and how to organize your research data and insights in a central place. And it's great that we have a true expert here with us today who will share her experience and learnings. Taylor, it's great to have you here. Taylor Jennings, she's a senior UX researcher with Chili Piper, a cool tool, which I'm sure we'll hear more about during this session. And she will share a bit of her process of from the early days when she realized that a research repository may be necessary or helpful to the point when they implemented this in the organization. Before working at Chili Piper, Taylor worked in consulting, and she has a lot of interest also in psychology behind decision-making, quantitative methods, and she's also mentoring women and those who are new to the UX space. Her personal interests lie in reading. She loves reading, and she was asking for book recommendations in case you have any. She's also pursuing her education in nonviolent communication, and which I found quite interesting, she's trying to visit all 63 US national parks. Taylor, one of additional question that we're going to add later on is how many of those you've already visited, but it's something for later today. So great to have you here, and thanks for joining, Taylor.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm excited to share what I've learned in using Condens with you all, and it's really helped me. So hopefully this will be helpful for some of you guys listening too.
Perfect, cool. So in case of some of you are wondering where Joey is, I'll mention it again. So Joey is having some technical issues and will join us a bit later. In case you have any questions for Taylor, please post them to the chat and we can address them right away. So I'm sure this is something where you would have a lot of questions and want to learn from someone who has gone through a process of setting up a research repository. And now let's get started right away. Taylor, maybe you can start with telling us a bit like what was going on at Chili Piper when you first realized that there may be a need for a research repository.
Sure. Yeah. So I started at Chili Piper last June and was our first hire for the UX research team. It was a pleasant surprise. I actually ended up having a second colleague by the time I joined because she had transferred from another department. But as the first hire, I kind of was really intentional in thinking about processes that would set us up for future success. So when we grow from 2 to 5 to 10, maybe researchers someday, what do we need to have in place and what's missing right now? And one of those things that I kind of saw an immediate need for was a research repository. So we had, our product team was doing research, our design team was doing a bit of research too, and keeping it in Google Drive, Google Docs, that sort of thing. There was really no central place to store it all and no central format. And I realized very quickly that if we wanted to scale and continue to grow, we were going to need something to help us. And so that was kind of one of my first charges. And when I started was picking the right tool, and there's quite a few out there, as some of you may know. So going through that process and decision-making process, I'm happy to talk on further, but that was kind of the impetus was, oh no, like we're going to need to access these insights one day soon. How do we do that? And how do we set that up from the ground for success in the future?
Makes sense. And something I encounter quite frequently is that researchers, especially as a team of one, are somewhat hesitant to introduce a repository or wondering whether it's a good thing to do as a sole researcher, simply because they're afraid it might be require too much time and they have the actual research that they need to do. What were your thoughts about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I had used a competing tool of Condens in the past in one of my consulting roles. And so I was familiar with the space and kind of what it could offer. And the time concern wasn't necessarily important, like something that was top of mind, just because how manual it was in our current process. It was very easy to see like, there's probably a better way to do this. And so in setting up Condens, once you kind of get your stuff in order, it is very easy to continue down a similar format. So again, if you're only a research team of 1, 2, I feel like that's probably the prime time to establish processes like that.
Okay. So even busting the myth that a research team of one cannot introduce a repository, it can even help you to save time and speed things up.
So much time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. And I'm looking forward to learn more about that. I see that in the meantime, Joy joined us. Hi there.
Yeah. Hi, Alex. My apologies on the
Hi.
issues here. I'm not sure what's going on. Great to see you guys.
Perfect to have you. Perfect timing. We just missed like, 4 minutes and we just got started. So let me still introduce Joey. So he's working as a researcher at MasterControl, which is a SaaS tool for life sciences and manufacturing. He spent the last 5 years in UX research and research insights roles. And prior to that, he worked in retail management and it turned out I didn't hear before, real estate escrow processing. So maybe that's another thing, off-topic thing we can talk about at the end of the session. Joey has a background in anthropology, and I learned that he also helped to develop the design ethnography certificate at the Boise State University. So very diverse background here. Thanks for joining and being here, Joey.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. Sorry, I'm on my phone, so the video and audio might be not the best. So
it's all right. We can hear you well. And we just started with the first question. So I also want to address this to you. What was going on at MasterControl when you realized that the research repository might be necessary? What were some indicators or trigger points for you?
Yeah, so there's probably several, and perhaps Taylor had a similar story. So hopefully I'm not too repetitive in terms of, it sounds very similar, I bet. But in our current role, we did have an older repository that we were using, and credit to my colleague there for getting something in place that it preceded my time. But what we ran into a few months ago was we were really looking for something that was more robust and intuitive. The platform that we had, there was numerous things that were going on, and it wasn't really, cutting it for us. And what we saw happening is we were getting a lot of research done, lots of interviews, all kinds of qualitative data, and getting a good amount of those summarized, but then it sort of piled up, and we didn't have a great way for others to get to this information all that easily. The previous platform that we had, it allowed for visitors to visit in there and kind of view only, but it seemed like they weren't really that enthusiastic about getting in there. And we really wanted to share out those findings to the stakeholders. And I found myself creating a lot of slides, a lot of slide decks, so I could distill all this down, because lots of words in the former repository we had, it just wasn't there, it wasn't digestible. So it was time consuming. We did a lot of affinity diagramming in other tools before I even created slides. And then we just couldn't create slides for every case. So we started kind of looking for something that was, much more robust for our needs.
Yeah, makes sense. And that's also an interesting perspective that you're bringing in here, that a repository also evolves over time, and also the platform or software that you're using may evolve over time. So you may start with something very simple, or that just does the job at that point, and then you evolve with that. Great. So maybe can you tell me a bit more about what the main advantages that you saw, and what was the prime thing that you wanted to achieve with the repository? Maybe Taylor, you can start with that.
Sure. So I think it was twofold. I think one big thing for us was, again, speed to insight. So how long does it take to do that actual digesting of videos? We did a lot of qualitative sessions too. So it takes a long time to read through transcripts and, put some notes in Google Docs and then put them back into a slide. It's a lot of back and forward. So cutting down on that analysis piece was huge for us. And I think secondarily, it was just having a place for people to go to when they had a question. And maybe this is too in the weeds, but we have, in addition to project tags, in our contents instance, global tags. So anytime something comes up that's like a usability issue, kind of outside the context of a study, we have it there. So it's just a space where people can kind of self-serve insights and try to figure something out before they come ask us to repeat research or dig through a study and send it to them. So that self-serve finding of historical insights, I think was also really big.
Yeah, makes sense. Joey, anything, does that match with what you try to achieve, or is that somewhat different?
Well, I think what we were trying to achieve were something that was centralized, that stakeholders that don't talk about research could go to easily without thinking. Video clips and audio clips was a big deal because, again, we could do lots and lots of text summaries, and that was not going anywhere. It was, it was like hitting a brick wall. So something that was more interactive and visual for them. And also, I think Taylor kind of touched on it, something that we can tag virtually when doing our affinity diagramming, and not having to be in the same room together always. That, we do have remote people, and being able to at any time do that affinity diagramming within a repository was something that we were really keen on. That just saved us time and streamlining instead of having to go out to other tools, do the diagramming, come back and try to put all that together.
Yeah, makes sense. And again, I like how this has different perspectives, like the sort of analysis and affinity, the diagramming aspect, which is more like bringing immediate benefits sort of, and helping you as the researchers, but then also having the stakeholder perspective, like what it's like for them, how do we make it easy for them to find things, how to make it also create an experience that it's something they want to sort of see with the videos, and video clips is playing a big role. And I like that aspect a lot as well, where you say like text only is a different thing than having like a short crisp clip which you can share and show. Great, Sina. Sorry. Any interesting questions from the chat? Any things that fit to that?
Yes, I think we can loop in some of the questions about like what kind of data makes it into the repository. You already mentioned that you put like from interviews to recordings into your repository, but maybe you can like tell us a little bit more about that. What kind of data makes it into the repository? And also we have a question, does the repository contain raw data as well as insights after analysis? Maybe who wants to take one of the questions?
I can jump on that, but we put, I say, so for the second question, we have both raw data and we have our findings in there. And, the raw data is great. It's kind of twofold because as I pointed out earlier, we didn't have a place to centralize. We kind of had an older repository, but having everything warehoused, or if that's the right word, to keep all that raw data that we can go back to and revisit if needed. But then second to that is having findings that are distilled down and digestible for stakeholders, for executives, for people who are not researchers, right? That they don't want to read all this. And so we have all of that there. And, like Condense, for example, does a great job of, we can have published findings that we can point people to, as well as raw findings. And in addition to video and video transcripts, we do have some surveys in there. We have notes. We have documents that customers have shared with us that are important to them, that we can look at and say, oh, wow, so this is what they're talking about. And we can put those documents in there attached to a specific project.
Thanks. Taylor, what about you? Is it the same for you?
Almost the same. Yep, I would say the same. Yeah, I think we put all of our raw data in there, so all interviews are immediately, recorded from Zoom to the tool. Surveys go in there too, documents as well. So yeah, very similar structure, similar benefits to those clips of, stakeholders can go in and very quickly look at the published report. And then if, a product manager or designer wants to go in and read individual transcripts or something like that, it's like everybody can self-service and the information in the way that works best for them. So I think that's, really helpful too, is having both the raw and finalized insights in there.
Maybe one more question from the chat. So we got a question, how do you ensure the repository stays up to date? And how do you make sure the team has the time and the motivation to update it?
Sure, I'll go with this one first. So for us as a research team of 2, it's very easy to direct 2 people to do something. It's just part of our process. So, we do an interview and we do the analysis in Condens, or we run a survey and make sure the analysis gets in there. So it's ingrained in part of our findings reports. Most of our findings reports do also come out of there as an output. So it's just a step in our analysis process. I think keeping it up to date, it kind of keeps itself up to date in a way if you're continuously adding to it. And then you still get that historical context. Maybe you've changed a feature, maybe you've redesigned something. So you can kind of see it over time. But there's really no maintenance in that regard, other than keeping sure like our tagging system is still working for us. Like I said, we have global tags across, so sometimes those need to get updated, but kind of updates itself.
Yeah.
Cool. Sorry, Joey, go ahead. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, sorry, nothing like, groundbreaking, pretty much what Taylor said. We also happen to be a team of 2. So we have great, collaboration, and we can, see like where we're at. If something is lagging and sitting out there, we can be like, oh, wait, why is that still there? And get to it and keep it fresh. And I do think a good part of that is being really over communicate with our stakeholders like PMs and designers and others about, hey, did you come to the repository? Here's a link to the repository, and kind of becoming almost annoying to them by always saying, oh, guess what? It's in the repository.
Yep.
So
it's huge.
Yeah. And I'd totally like to dig into the implementation and rollout sort of phase. And after that, maybe one question before, did you have to convince others in your organization, like people you work with, your boss, of getting a repository? And if so, how did you do that? Taylor, again, please go ahead.
Yeah. We definitely had to convince people. And I can say in a previous role, I actually had this same situation. We did not have a repository. We had kind of a SharePoint sharing shared file. And that was a lot of work to convince people in that previous role and get a repository in place. So I understand the battle. It was really an uphill kind of a battle. And I do think the research suffered for it because it was not as easily accessible. In this current role, we still had to convince, when we went from this kind of older platform that we were using to something that had the aspects that we wanted, we had to talk to our director, some other executives, as well as some technical people internally, and show, kind of make the case for why we were going to spend the money on a repository, what it did for us, and what it did for a product ultimately. So it was definitely on us as the researchers to show that we found value in having a repository, and specifically how we found value for our product team and others. And so we got our director and others involved as we evaluated solutions and talked to some different places for solutions.
My experience was quite different. I was very new to the company and didn't know what the purchase process was. So I made this really convincing document comparing all of the options and really explaining the current state and what was so bad about it and how we could get to the future state. And I think once folks just understood the conceptual advantages of a repository versus using Google Drive like we were currently using, it was a very quick, yeah, go for it, it's fine. Just let us know what you need. So I did do all of the legwork of trying to convince people when I really didn't have to. But if anybody's in that similar boat, this is a little bit of a shameless plug, but I did write kind of like a breakdown of what that process looked like to like compare across, and ultimately how we decided on this tool. So I'm more than happy to share that resource and kind of like what the matrix of features and such looked like for us, because I did more work than I needed to, but then it made me feel really confident in the choice that we made.
Yeah, and I could just recommend that that piece that Taylor wrote. Maybe we can post it to the chat later on. So that this brings us exactly to the next topic, like evaluation. And we have this great blog post from Taylor, but maybe Taylor, can you quickly summarize what were your steps? What did you go through, and what were the main criteria that you were looking for in choosing a repository solution?
Sure. Yeah. So main criteria, I think, really came down to security was a thing for us. What happens with participants' data, that sort of thing. What does it come with versus having to pay for additional options? There are some tools that are tiered. Pricing was a minor component, but more so the functionality of, again, speed to insight was a big thing for us. We wanted this to be a part of our process. And so finding a tool that made it easy to, do those kind of affinity mappings and things like that, that was huge. A nice plus that Condens had that some others did not was the participant managed system or management system. So tracking who you've talked to, when, and about what was kind of a maybe like a tipping point of something that pushed us over the edge. But I think those were the big ones. Yeah.
Cool. Great. And super cool also to see like how different considerations are playing here. Not only the tool itself and functionality and usability, obviously that's an important point, and pricing, but also like IT security, legal, privacy, all these other aspects. Well, because you have to go through like procurement and go through that process. Joy, you want to add to that? And how was it for you?
Yeah, well, in terms of evaluation, we knew we wanted something I kind of mentioned earlier that gave us features we didn't have. We were after, the basics like highlighting and tags, that's kind of a must, but, transcription is a must, but having like video clips, sound clips was important. And then again, having something that was more intuitive and like drag and drop, if you will, and like, with that affinity diagramming, being able to do something within a platform was a big deal. And one other thing that was really critical for us was implementation. Because we already had a previous platform, we wanted to make sure we could bring over existing raw files, as well as even some of those text files that we had from our previous platform and incorporate that. And also part of our business requirements were to have an SSO with our SSO provider Okta. And so those were also key for us to make sure that we could bring over that old stuff and use an SSO.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And I just see in the chat that participant management seems to be important, especially for B2B companies where you have like a sales team which is super, careful about who is talking to who, or just wants to be informed and know. But also for the research team themselves, obviously, to know, like, not to over contact people and be aware of who you already talked to and at what time and about which topics. Great. So we talked about the sort of learning about the needs for the repository, convincing the stakeholders, going through the process, evaluation criteria. So maybe let's talk more about the repository itself and the learning step that you made. Like Taylor and Joy, you've both used the repository for quite some time now. One thing I would particularly be interested in is, obviously, did it solve the problems that you intended to solve, but also did it come with any unexpected like learnings, any things you didn't expect, maybe things that were better than you thought, maybe tougher or took longer than you thought? How was that?
Yeah, we found a few unexpected advantages once we implemented it that we were pleasantly surprised by. First is kind of the drag and drop ease. We had an idea in our head that we wanted to have something that was more centralized, but once we started using this, as we were building conclusions, and like I said, a big time expenditure for us was doing affinity diagramming sessions with designers and with PMs. Very valuable, very rich, time for us. However, it was a lot of time, and others besides us researchers were saying, do we have to do that again, you guys? Anyway, once we got in Condens, it was fantastic that we could have all of our tags and drag those right into a conclusion with other people on the call as we're working. So that was a big, exciting kind of advantage that we weren't expecting. Having the video and audio also in a conclusion where we can share a URL is also a big exciting thing for us. That so far we've had some nice comments that not just a slide static presentation, they can look at the clips that we're saying with less work from us as researchers having to, download, save, clip, and find that video clip and bring it over to a slide presentation. We can have it all in there, so it streamlines a lot for us.
Yeah, very similar here. I think with the clips that you can put into your presentation and make it a multimedia or a multimedia kind of findings report, it drives a level of empathy that I don't think you get when you just read a document. And being able to actually see somebody struggle with something or speak to something in their own words for a stakeholder is so much different than seeing it in text on a slide. So I think that's the big advantage for us. And as researchers, we knew we were going to get that, but seeing the aha moment of product managers and designers when they realize oh yeah, there's this tool you said was going to be cool, but it was really impactful for them too, which was great. And I think that was really a great moment for us, was seeing that realization for people. The thing that I struggle with still, and I'm just kind of pushing for always, is something Joe mentioned earlier of pushing stakeholders to the repository or to the findings document. Sometimes they'll ask a one-off question and I've just gotten used to replying to it. And I'm trying to retrain myself to say hey, go look at the findings report, go look at this, versus just answering those questions. But that's a me problem, not a tool problem. But yeah, it's been great. It's very easy to learn too, which I think is was a requirement for us too, it's intuitive as an interface to onboard to. So no surprises or anything really there.
Cool, great. And yeah, this video clip topic, this keeps coming up. And it's so interesting, what the differences can make, whether you have just a text-based quote or an actual user or customer saying something. And these aha moments is something that we ourselves also realized, even up to a point where this can be turn into a negative effect where I don't know, product manager or someone has just this one video clip in mind which they saw and sort of overvalues that almost. So there's even the other side of that, but obviously it's a matter of curation and putting that into perspective. So yeah, that's great. And what I also find interesting is that this topic of analysis and synthesis and the process comes up again and again, and how important it is to have this in a collaborative way, but also have this in a way that there's no breaks sort of between tools, and then from the point where you have the raw data through the structuring and so on until the point where you share it, because if I got Joey correctly there, then this is something that takes time, but also that you lose sort of the connections of where was something coming from, what was the source of that, and going back to the original sort of. Great. I have one or two more questions, but I want to bring in Sina again, because I see that chat is also very active and there's many questions in there. So let's tackle those first.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, we got a lot of questions. Thank you so much. So maybe we can start with, we just spoke about stakeholders using the repository, and we got a question about the different audiences you target with the research repository. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that. So who actually uses it and for what different purposes?
I can go.
Yeah, want me to take that one?
Go for it.
All right. Yeah, so if I'm understanding the question correctly, when we're tagging, so for stakeholders, one of the challenges I found was the taxonomy or the tag structure, and we're both still kind of figuring that out and how it works. So obviously we want stakeholders to come and use this and get in here, and I'm constantly, we're both saying, yeah, check out the repository, but then at the same time, it's not letting our tags become out of control. So that's something we're balancing. Something that works really well is a global tag that we've really found success with and really have enjoyed. And so, for example, I was speaking with a designer a few weeks ago, and they're working on this project over here and had a specific question about something. I was working on these other projects, had heard this come up, trying to cross-reference that. And, you know, we all run into that all the time, right? Like, oh, this cross-reference to here. And so we were able to go in there. I went in and retroactively added some tags, shared that global tag with the designer and the PM. And that was helpful because then they could reference a little bit older research, current research, all in one global tag. So that's one example. If I answered all that, I don't know if I missed something on there. So.
Yeah, we have several different audiences too. So there's myself and the other researcher who are actively going in there and editing, tagging, making conclusions, that sort of thing. Then we have our product managers, our designers who will go in there to kind of similar to what Joe was mentioning, like look at maybe specific tags or maybe just read the findings reports. Sometimes they'll dig deeper into watching sessions if they have more questions for context. And then lastly, we have our like even higher level stakeholders who will get about as far as the executive summary at the top of the insights report, but they will still go click and look at it. So it is kind of nice too. I think one thing that really set Condons apart also is the like ability to invite people to view only for free, which is a big differentiator for us. Is like I could give the designers and the PMs permission to come look without giving them edit permission or having to pay for them to come look. So yeah, it's tailorable for multiple audiences.
And Joey, you started with like the tags and different level of tags. We got a question on that as well. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about how you both approach the framework of the repository in terms of creating a taxonomy or finding tags or how to categorize your data? How did you get started with that?
Yeah, that's a really good question because I think it can vary a lot depending on like the industry and your organization and, you know, probably lots of factors there. But really what we focused on is breaking things into different groups of like what's housekeeping stuff for us as like researchers or like business, just background stuff that has really nothing to do with findings or learnings, you know, something like this was the date, you know, this is the incentive we gave, things like that. So we have a group of tags like that. Then we just started breaking down our tags into by group things that are relevant, you know. So often our sessions are prototype driven, so we're moderating with a prototype. So a lot of the tags end up being like a customer journey type confusion. This was intuitive, things like that. That what I'd say are the vast majority of our tags. And then we have some other tags of like, this is a pain point, this is a job to be done, this is a positive, this is a negative, that are big call outs, you know, that really pop out, that we really want us or someone else to see that, you know, this is a top finding. And then, you know, probably, so, I mean, I think we have roughly 5 or 6 groups that we routinely go back to. And then we have a few tags that are like product, you know, and this is kind of referencing that cross-reference I was talking about, like product driven or marketing and sales, even like, ooh, wow, this is really, this is a nugget that I know this PM would want and possibly like sales would want to hear from a PM. You know, this is a very valuable nugget. So that's kind of roughly how we incorporate it. And one thing we're being cautious about is our global tags. We don't want those to become overused. So we use project tags heavily, and then the global tags we use when we know it's a very powerful tag that has very clear evidence in the learnings, if that makes sense.
Totally.
Yeah.
Ella, do you want to add something to that?
Sure. Yeah, the tagging is something we are kind of always talking about because it does vary from project to project. And just for context, we are a B2B software provider. So the way we're using it might be very different from others. So similar to Joe, we do have like project level tags will include they're mostly prototype driven as well. So it's task success, fail, delight, pain point, etc. And then the global tags are different features across the application that might come up. So for example, a lot of times we'll get into a session to talk about a very specific feature, but something like onboarding might come up or our navigation might come up. So we make sure to tag those as global so that any time somebody's mentioning something outside of the context of our project, they can go back and look at it, as well as like insight into competitors and that kind of thing. So we do, I will say, keep a better handle on the global tags. That's the one that as a team, we're always talking about how to refine, how to make sure we're not adding too many, because it's very easy to think everything deserves its own category. But then project tags are like kind of the Wild West as far as like for that specific project, we kind of do whatever we need to make it work and keep the handle on the global ones.
Super interesting that you like both came to a similar approach with like going wide in the project tags, but having like a more fixed set of global tags on that level. And maybe we can do one more question from the chat. So we got one question about like the findings. If you just 1 second, how do you like tag, or how do you categorize between short-term and long-term learnings? Is this like a category you use for your findings, and how do you go about that in the repository?
That's not for us. We don't use, I wouldn't think of it as short-term, long-term. For us, really that short-term is kind of a project by project basis, and long-term is those more global tags. So like when a journey insight comes in, or like Joe mentioned, a job to be done, or a universal pain point, I think of those as more long-term objectives, and the project as short-term, for better or for worse. I don't know if that's the right way to do it, but that's how we're currently doing it.
Yeah, I think we're probably in a similar situation, what Taylor described there. We don't, and I guess part of that is we're sort of transitioning some of our platform to different product for our customers, and this is kind of inherently like future driven or future focused, and so like all of those sessions and groupings kind of fall into that that future driven approach that the company is taking. And then and some of the current stuff is not even all that heavily research, because we won't be doing a ton with it in the next few years. So it gets some attention, but not nearly as much as the other side. So I mean, as I think about that, I don't know that we really delineate all that much, because I mean that's a great question in terms of short-term learnings and long-term, because they kind of roll into each other as we go, and we hope and strive as an organization to iterate on the findings and what the customers are telling us, so it kind of rolls into each other and becomes longer term.
Well, that's like the beauty of it too, right? Is if we are testing a feature now for a redesign that's to take place in 6 months, and then 6 months we test it again, like we already have those historical findings to go back and look at. So the short term become long term, because you can always go back and reference them if you've done the work of tagging them and analyzing them in a way that's digestible. So they just like build on top of each other, I think, in a way that's really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said.
So Alex, maybe I get back to you.
Perfect. Cool. Yeah, there's one sort of last question I want to ask. Is there anything in hindsight that you would do differently now? Any learnings that you have that you want to share with the group now for people who are planning to start a research repository? How about that? Taylor, maybe you can start.
I think in hindsight, I would have done a little bit more upfront work with our product team to get them using it a bit more. So the researcher and I are using this like crazy for all of our studies, and some PMs use it, others don't, but they're still having conversations with customers. So there's still information living in a spot that's not connected to this. And slowly but surely, I'm kind of nudging them over here, but I wish I would have done a better job at the beginning of getting everybody on board to say, okay, this is our process for everybody having conversations with customers, regardless of where you fit in the process, and just made it a little more systematic in that way. It doesn't like there's not as many conversations that they're having as we are, and we do have another tool we can go in and access to look at it, but I would do that a little differently.
Well, in a similar vein to what Taylor's saying, I think I would insist on some of the advantages of having everything in one place earlier on. So for anyone that is watching or reads this, or listens to this, definitely, find something that streamlines your process as a researcher, because there was a lot of time spent in going from one place to another, and doing the synthesis and doing the summarization with different tools that were available to us. When for a cost that seems very reasonable, at least to me, it really saves so much time for researchers that we can then, talk to other PMs and more stakeholders about doing more research. Because the two of us are always pretty much at max, and so something that saves us time helps a lot. So I would have pushed harder earlier for something that streamlined our process.
Great. And yeah, it's also great to see how the repository really should and can help the researchers. I think oftentimes there's this notion that a repository is only there to store existing findings, so that stakeholders can go there, but that's totally not the case. So, and I'm also a big fan of making it transparent. This is something that the researchers benefit from directly, and then obviously involving the stakeholders and having them on board is important. Maybe related to that, we have another question about the tags. Tags seem to be an important topic. How did you make the tags intuitive to the stakeholders who are searching your repository? Do you involve stakeholders in creating the tags? How did that work? Joey, maybe you can go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I think kind of what Taylor was saying, it's kind of the Wild West for us in the localized projects. And I will say in the previous platform that we were using it was very different in a lot of ways, but we were really trying to encourage some other partners of ours to use it, and it did become kind of wild in there. Some of the tags were very just well, wait, that doesn't really make sense for some of this project. So in terms of letting stakeholders create something that's intuitive that they can find, I think it's kind of tricky. I think we try to use something that is natural and natural language for the projects that we encounter in our organization. So very intuitive, not too erudite or anything like that. That we can just say something simple that in chats with our PMs that would make sense. That would be their most logical. So we really try to speak in the PM's language. And I would say that the researchers are doing a lot more tagging than PMs are for us in our example. So we kind of, and I think honestly, as I talk about this and think about it, the PMs and other stakeholders are kind of looking for us as researchers, the two of us, to kind of lead and direct or steer them with those tags. I think some of the barrier of getting into the repository is sort of intimidation. They won't necessarily say that, but they're like, what is this new tool and all these tags? And so I think it helps a lot if we give them a framework of tags and kind of a direction, and then let them also play in there and get more comfortable. That way they don't get in there and become completely overwhelmed. At least in our case, that's kind of how it shook out.
Yeah, I think we have a similar sense as far as providing guidance to make sense of the data that we have is something that they're looking to us to do. And I would say our stakeholders get involved in the sense that we always start a project with a research brief, and we derive our tags normally from that brief, unless something else obviously comes up during the research, then we'll create new tags as well. So we're all pretty aligned to the objectives we're trying to get out of an engagement or out of a study. And so those objectives typically align to a group of tags. So it's again, a language we're speaking all together, and a language hopefully they're familiar with. And if they read the brief and comments on it, I've seen. So just trying to keep them in the loop in that regard. But again, speaking their language, I think is the biggest thing. And I think the thing that's nice too, is you can provide a description of what a tag means. So if there's any sort of ambiguity, you can write 1 to 2 sentences of ABC means 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then that way everybody's got the same definition and no one can, and people can still get confused, but hopefully it's a little bit easier for people to self-serve their confusion.
Yeah, great. And then maybe to add from like an information architecture perspective, tags are obviously an important way to organize data, especially for researchers, but it doesn't necessarily mean that also stakeholders are using the tags to search. So you could give stakeholders access on an even higher level, like on a conclusion, as it's called in comments, basically like a report or summary level, and they don't have to worry about the stakeholders, but about the tags. But this obviously depends on how closely related to the stakeholders are to the research team and how closely they work together. Perfect, cool. I think in terms of timing, we are slowly getting back to the main conference. I want to say thank you so much to Taylor and Joey for joining us today. I think just the amount of people here in the Zoom and the amount of questions that we got showed how much of interest that this topic generates and how relevant this is. So thank you for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate it.